3,305 Huey helicopters were destroyed out of 7,013 sent to Vietnam, a 47% attrition rate unmatched in modern air warfare. The machine that became the lifeline for over 90,000 medevac missions also became an airborne death trap for its crews. On May 2, 1972, that vulnerability turned lethal when the first Huey fell to an unseen $15,000 SA-7 missile outside Quang Tri. This is how a single weapon exposed the fatal paradox of America's most iconic helicopter, and why those numbers still reverberate through every battlefield today. Nearly half the fleet was lost, an attrition rate that stands alone in the history of modern military aviation. The numbers are stark, but they only hint at the scale of what the Huey represented on the battlefield. This machine logged over 10 million flight hours across the jungles and rice paddies of Southeast Asia, serving as the backbone of American air mobility. The Huey was more than a transport. It became the core of the air cavalry, the mainstay of resupply, and the single most important platform for medical evacuation. Its silhouette meant hope for wounded soldiers pinned down behind enemy lines. Over 90,000 medevac missions were flown by Hueys in Vietnam, with the average wounded man reaching a field hospital in under 60 minutes, a turnaround that had been unthinkable in previous wars. In World War II or Korea, evacuation could take days. In Vietnam, it was often less than an hour from injury to surgery. The difference was measured in lives saved, and the Huey's role in this transformation was absolute. Each mission came with a price. Every time a Huey descended into a landing zone, whether for a hot extraction, a supply drop, or a medevac pickup, the crew accepted the risk of ground fire, mechanical failure, or worse. The aircraft's open doors, exposed fuel tanks, and unarmored engine made it vulnerable to everything from small arms to heavy machine guns. Yet the operational doctrine demanded constant exposure. The logic was simple: mobility and speed could outpace the enemy's ability to react. The statistics tell a different story. Of the 3,305 Hueys destroyed, over 2,700 crew members were killed, 1,151 pilots, and 1,231 crew, not counting the thousands of passengers lost in the chaos of combat and evacuation. The scale of loss was matched only by the scale of necessity. The Huey was indispensable, and that indispensability forced commanders and crews to tolerate risks that would have been unacceptable in any other context. The paradox was built into the design. The very features that made the Huey essential, such as low-level flight, rapid insertion, and the ability to hover, also made it an easy target. Before new threats arrived, the war's math was already brutal. The next chapter would reveal just how quickly that balance could turn catastrophic. Huey crews flew into a world defined by visible threats and familiar dangers. The doctrine was blunt, enemy fire was a constant, but it could be managed. Pilots trained for nap-of-the-earth flight, skimming treetops, dipping into ravines, using the jungle itself as cover. The goal was to stay below the arcs of anti-aircraft guns and to deny gunners a clean shot. The most feared weapon on the ground was the DSHK, a 12.7mm heavy machine gun, its muzzle flash often the only warning. Door gunners watched for muzzle bursts and tracers, returning fire with M60 machine guns as the Huey flared into a landing zone. The threat was always there, but it was tangible, audible, and above all, expected. Doctrine accepted that losses would occur. Army memos from the late 1960s refer to helicopter casualties as an unavoidable cost of air mobility. Loss rates were tracked, but the math seemed stable. The majority of downed Hueys fell to small arms fire, heavy machine guns, or the dense curtain of anti-aircraft artillery. Crews calculated their odds on every mission. The risk felt personal, but it was also institutional, a trade-off between speed, reach, and exposure. Commanders believed that rapid insertions and extractions could outpace the enemy's ability to react. The Huey's speed, at low altitude, was its shield. Every tactic was built around the idea that the enemy had to see you to shoot you. The nap of the earth approach was more than just a flying style, it was a doctrine of survival. The Huey's design, broad doors, exposed engine, high tail boom, made it agile but left vital systems unprotected. Crews accepted this, trusting that their ability to move fast and low would keep them alive. The risk was present, but it was calculable, bounded by the limits of human vision and reaction time. No one imagined a weapon that could hunt the Huey by heat alone, striking from beyond sight, without warning. That certainty would not last. May 2nd, 1972. The crew of UH-1 H-tail number 7015863 lifted off for a medevac near Quang Tri. Warrant Officer William Jesse was at the controls. Beside him, co-pilot John Petrilla. In the back, Specialist Charles Vernon Morgan and Specialist Dale Cayette Porterfield manned the guns. Their passenger was Captain Joseph Mike Berkson, an ARVN advisor. 5 men, 1 airframe, flying a mission they had performed dozens of times in the previous month, extraction under fire, with the expectation of ground threats, but not the unknown. The aircraft's Lycoming T-53 turbine pushed a hot exhaust plume into the humid air, invisible to the naked eye, but glaring in the infrared spectrum. The SA-7 Strela waited below. This was a Soviet-designed, shoulder-fired missile, newly arrived on the battlefield. Its seeker, a simple, uncooled lead sulfide sensor, needed only a few seconds to lock on to the heat signature trailing from the Huey's tail. The engagement envelope ran from 500 to 2,300 meters, with a 30-degree cone behind the target. For the crew, there was no warning, no radar ping, no audible alert, just routine radio chatter and the steady thump of rotor blades. The missile cost $15,000. The Huey, including airframe, engine, and training, was worth over $250,000. The economics were brutal. The Strela's seeker latched onto the exhaust as Jesse's crew hovered low, waiting for a signal to extract the downed forward air controller. The launch was silent. The missile arced upward, closing the distance in seconds. There was no time for evasive action. The impact tore through the tail boom, severing the drive shaft. The Huey spun uncontrollably and crashed, killing all 5 aboard. The accident board found no pilot error, no mechanical failure. The only anomaly was the sudden loss of tail rotor authority and the telltale residue of a missile strike. The crew's last transmissions made no mention of a threat. In the days that followed, flight logs and after-action reports recorded the event in clinical terms. UH-1H, tail number 7015863, destroyed by enemy action. 5 fatalities. Mission: medevac. Cause: infrared guided missile. For commanders and crews, the loss was more than another number. Until that day, the calculus of risk had been grounded in visible threats, machine gun, rifles, anti-aircraft guns. Now, the battlefield had changed. The SA-7 could hunt by heat alone, tracking targets from beyond sight, beyond sound, beyond warning. The destruction of Jesse's crew was not just a single loss. It was the first proof that the old rules no longer applied. Every Huey in Vietnam had become a target for a weapon that cost a fraction of its value. The tactical shock rippled outward as flight crews and planners realized that the air mobility revolution had met its first true nemesis. In the weeks after May 2nd, 1972, the numbers began to climb with alarming speed. 16 aircraft were lost in the Quang Tri sector alone, an entire flight's worth of hardware and crews erased in a matter of days. The losses included not just Hueys, but also the first fixed-wing casualty to a shoulder-fired missile, an O-2A forward air controller brought down by a Strela in the same deadly corridor. Gunships were no safer. The AH-1 Cobra, designed to escort and protect troop carriers, found itself just as vulnerable. Its slim profile and speed counted for little against a missile that needed only a plume of hot exhaust to find its mark. Flight logs from the 1st Cavalry Division tell the story in clipped, anxious entries. Pilots who had spent years mastering nap of the earth flying were now ordered to climb 1,000 feet higher, sometimes more, trading the risk of small arms fire for exposure inside the Strela's engagement envelope. Radio transcripts captured the confusion. The phrase missile was shouted across open channels, followed by silence or a burst of static. There was no visual cue, no muzzle flash to track. Crews scanned the tree line for the telltale glint of a launch tube, but the missile itself was invisible until too late. The old logic of survival, move fast, stay low, trust your eyes, no longer applied. Medevac pilots faced impossible choices. The Doctrine had always demanded that wounded men be reached, no matter the odds. Now every descent toward a landing zone meant gambling not just with ground fire, but with a weapon that could strike from beyond sight at any moment. Some missions were aborted mid-flight, the risk judged too great. Others went ahead, and the cost was paid in full. The loss rate doubled as crews struggled to adapt, and the familiar rhythm of air mobility gave way to hesitation and paralysis. The psychological effect was immediate, corrosive. Aviators who had once measured danger in seconds of exposure now found themselves grounded for hours, waiting for clearance that might never come. Entire formations were held back, critical resupply flights delayed, wounded men left on the ground longer than Doctrine allowed. The 16 aircraft lost in Quang Tri were not just hardware, they were a warning that the battlefield had changed overnight. The Strela did not discriminate. Slicks, gunships, even fixed-wing spotters were all targets. The math of destruction was no longer stable. The air was tempo broke, and with it the sense of control that had defined the Huey era. The need for new tactics, new defenses, and a new understanding of vulnerability had become inescapable. Orders arrived by radio and memo, not suggestion. Helicopters were to climb. Minimum altitude, 1,000 feet above ground. The old nap of the earth doctrine, skimming treetops, hiding behind terrain, was set aside. Commanders calculated that greater height might buy a few seconds against the SA-7 Strela, trading the certainty of rifle and machine gun fire for the uncertainty of a missile strike. Crews were told to increase speed, limit time over landing zones, and avoid hovering whenever possible. The cost was immediate. Higher altitudes meant longer exposure to the Strela's engagement envelope, from 500 to 2,300 meters behind the aircraft, a space that no amount of skill could close. Pilots lost the cover of the jungle, and with it the ability to shield wounded or resupply teams in contested zones. Medevac missions that once landed within yards of the casualty now set down hundreds of meters away, forcing ground troops to drag their wounded through open fire. Technical fixes lagged far behind tactical improvisation. The Army's answer was the ALQ-144 infrared jammer, a spinning emitter designed to confuse the Strela's heat-seeking sensor. But procurement and testing took time. Fielding the first units required 12 to 18 months. In the interim, crews relied on speed and luck. Jammer tests reported a 60% success rate in controlled environments, but only 30% in combat conditions. The device drew heavy electrical power weighed down the airframe, and was never fitted to every Huey. Army memos from 1973 acknowledged the gap. The threat had arrived before the solution. For every new directive, there was a trade-off. Altitude and speed reduced some risks, but left others untouched. The missile's reach and the lag in countermeasures meant that the Huey remained a target, just at a different angle. The AH-1 Cobra, built to escort Hueys, was meant to shield troop carriers from ground fire. Its narrow fuselage and greater speed offered little protection against the Strela. In the months after Quang Tri, 10 Cobras fell to infrared-guided missiles. Each loss carried its own irony. The hunter became the hunted, the gunship's exhaust as vulnerable as the transports it guarded. Flight records from the Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association list Cobras by tail number and date, their missions ending in abrupt silence, escort runs, convoy overwatch, medevac cover, each cut short by a heat seeker that needed only a plume of turbine exhaust to find its mark. The psychological cost outpaced the material. South Vietnamese pilots, once confident in air mobility, began refusing missions. Oral histories describe entire squadrons grounded by rumor alone, stories of invisible missiles, of Cobras and Hueys vanishing without warning. In March 1975, 3 Hueys were shot down near Pleiku in a single day. The shock triggered a wave of refusals and mutinies. Commanders threatened courts martial, but fear outlasted discipline. By April, as North Vietnamese forces pressed toward Saigon, more than 800 aircraft and helicopters were destroyed or captured. Airfields filled with abandoned machines, Hueys, Cobras, Sky Raiders, left behind by crews who no longer believed survival was possible. The collapse of South Vietnamese air power was not just a matter of hardware lost. It was a breakdown of trust in the air itself. The Strela had neutralized not only helicopters, but the will to fly them. The final numbers stand as a record of compounding failures. 10 Cobras downed by the very threat they were meant to counter, and over 800 aircraft lost in the final months of the war. The vulnerability exposed in Vietnam did not end with the last Huey left behind on an abandoned airfield. The arrival of man-portable air defense systems, MANPADS, reset the calculus for helicopter crews everywhere. In the Soviet war in Afghanistan, the Mi-24 Hind, a heavily armored gunship, met the same fate as the Huey. 42 Mi-24s were destroyed by shoulder-fired missiles, many by US-supplied Stingers. Analysis of Mujahideen records and Soviet after-action reports shows a kill rate as high as 79% for Stinger launches against Hinds. The lesson was unmistakable. Armor and speed offered little protection when a missile could home in on a hot exhaust plume from miles away. The proliferation of MANPADS has only accelerated. By the early 2000s, estimates from RAND and the CIA placed the global stockpile between 500,000 and 750,000 units. These weapons, portable, concealable, and devastating, now shadow every battlefield, every relief mission, every civilian flight path in unstable regions. The cost equation remains brutally lopsided. A modern missile, whether Strela or Stinger, can be had for $50,000 on the black market. A new utility helicopter costs upwards of $20 million. The same imbalance that doomed the Huey and the Mi-24 persists. A single operator with a shoulder-fired missile can erase years of training, millions in hardware, and the lives of an entire crew in seconds. Helicopter doctrine has changed, but the risk has not disappeared. Infrared jammers, flare dispensers, and exhaust suppressors are now mandatory on frontline aircraft. Pilots are trained to assume every ridge or rooftop could hide a missile team. Yet the numbers do not lie. The world remains awash in MANPADS, and the vulnerability that started in the jungles of Vietnam has become a permanent feature of air warfare. For every crew that straps in today, the shadow of Quang Tri and the legacy of 3,305 lost Hueys still hangs overhead. Today, more than 500,000 man-portable air defense systems remain unaccounted for worldwide. The same $15,000 missile that turned a Huey's exhaust plume into a death sentence now shadows every low-flying helicopter from Mali to Ukraine. No armor, no countermeasure fully erases the vulnerability revealed in Vietnam. In the calculus of asymmetric warfare, technology advances, but so does the cost in lives and machines. The equation remains unsolved. What do you think? Share your thoughts below.